nice to see you all, even though I can't see many of you, but nice to see you all. Please feel free to continue to comment and share links and stuff in the chat. But if you are sharing questions, please pop them in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we come to that in a bit. So cool. So hi, I'm Meri Williams. I'm experienced CTO, been at a whole bunch of different places, including grew up at Procter Gamble, worked for the government digital service for a while, was at M&S, then at Moo, then at Monzo and Healx, all as CTO. But I ended up giving this talk more because of some of the other things on here, such as me having a rare disease. So I've got Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a genetic collagen defect. My body's blueprint for collagen is pretty much broken, and so I end up with all sorts of interesting dislocations and stuff like that. But I'm kind of like in the minority in a number of different ways, and so I joke quite often with people that I'm the one the Daily Mail warned you about, right? I'm a woman working in tech, which makes me a little unusual, sadly. I'm queer and I'm foreign. I'm employed, which is a bad thing. Like, I'm an immigrant with a job, which I think is worse than living off the state, but I've got to check the headlines regularly to be sure. I've got a physical disability. I'm neurodiverse. I'm godless. And my wife is British, so I'm literally over here stealing your women and your jobs, right? But I grew up very aware of unasked and undeserved and unearned privilege, because I grew up white in apartheid, and my childhood, maybe some of the other folks who are on the call, like, was full of signs that, like these, that Ned Blancas just means whites only, and this is saying the sea, the beach, the bathrooms are all whites only. And the reality is that this ridiculous paleness that means I can't even catch a tan when I live in South Africa gave me a load of benefits that I didn't earn, didn't ask for. And pretending that's not the case isn't very useful. So the thing that I try to do instead is kind of assess, understand, acknowledge that privilege, and then do something about it. If you've not actively thought about privilege before, one of the best things to go and read, and I'll share these materials afterwards and all the links and everything as well. But one of the really kind of seminal articles or papers in this regard was by Peggy McIntosh, talking about unpacking the invisible knapsack, all these things that she had as privilege, like benefits that she had that she'd never even actively thought about, that she hadn't considered as they were just normal to her. And I think that's a pretty good explanation of what privilege is. It's the things that are automatically easier, not easy, but easier for you because of something that's an innate quality that you didn't work at all. And obviously, having grown up in apartheid, like, racism is extreme, like, it was legislated there, it was very obvious. One of the things that surprised me traveling around the world, working in loads of different places, is how severe that bias still is without it being quite as blatant and quite as obvious. And one of the real problems we have in tech is we have this, what is unfortunately just like a pernicious lie. I agree with Anil's wording here, that it's a meritocracy. Like, we have plenty of evidence that it isn't just about what you do. There's a whole, computing, for instance, computer used to be a job title. The early computers were almost all women. They were doing mathematical calculations for things like the space program. Our modern world, where, like, there's not a sufficient proportion of the industry are not women, is largely because of choices that have been made over the last 40-ish years, rather than an innate difference in suitability. And I'll talk a lot today about kind of equality and equity, making things fair, but it's important to recognize, as this graphic tries to demonstrate, that treating people the same doesn't lead to equity or equality. In this example, you give everybody the same box to stand on. One person could already see over. Now the middle person is doing a little bit better, but the other person still can't see at all. So the most underprivileged, by everybody being treated exactly the same, it leads to unequal outcomes. And so when you'll hear it's sometimes a little bit technical, but like you'll hear people starting to talk about equity instead of equality. And that's because people have overly understood equality to mean treat people the same rather than try to get equal outcomes. And so bear in mind, whenever we talk about this stuff, sometimes to get the equality of outcome, the equality of opportunity, we have to acknowledge that people are in a different starting position. If you or anybody around you has like issues with that concept, needs an illustration of it or whatever, there's a pretty useful thing called the privilege walk. And if you Google it, you'll find examples on YouTube of people doing actual physical things where they start everybody on the same starting line, and then they say, okay, take a step forward if you had both parents at home growing up. Take a step forward if someone was around to help you with your homework. Take another step forward if you could have gone to college without any kind of scholarship. And by the time they've read out all these statements, there's a real difference in the starting position for a lot of people. And it's a really useful way to talk about this concept with your colleagues if they're struggling with it. And so not discriminating is important, like legally, if nothing else. It's illegal in most of the countries that certainly that people were dialing in from. But I feel like tolerance isn't what we should be aiming for. Like, people tolerate when they kind of hate you, but they put up with you. I'm not sure being put up with is the bar I want for work. And so rather than aiming for tolerance, let's think about how, inclusion's a spectrum, diversity is a spectrum. And, we recognize when there's active hatred, discrimination. We talk about microaggressions a lot more now, and I'll go and talk about those a bit more in a second. And maybe the middle of this is indifference, and maybe it's slightly better to be tolerant than to be indifferent, but I'm not sure. But active inclusion is very different from just not discriminating, right? You need to do more. You need to focus a lot more. A good example of a microaggression is one from Farouk here, which is, we tell young boys very often that they're very smart, but we tell young girls that they're very pretty. And I remember being a young girl who was pretty angry every time somebody tried to tell me I was pretty, both because I didn't really believe it, and I was like, I don't give a fuck. Why would I care? Yes, young Meri was very gay very early, but that's a whole separate issue. And there's lots and lots of examples. And a microaggression, another great video I saw, described these as like mosquito bites. One doesn't bother you too much, but you don't know when you subject somebody else to a microaggression whether it's their like 100th mosquito bite that day, in which case they might react a little different than if it was the first one. Another really like classic example of microaggression is people asking, where are you from? Where are your family from? No, where are you really from? To people of color. Where, there's a hilarious, wonderful, beautiful example of this where it's Shirley Bassey, Dame Shirley Bassey, of the, sang Bond songs and so on, fame. And this interviewer is asking her, where are you from? Cardiff. And where your parent? Cardiff. And it was like Cardiff all the way down, right? And she was just not going to let this like shitty racist question be asked. She just kept like staring into the eyes and saying Cardiff. I enjoy actually, but because I'm like a fucking white person who people assume is English, I enjoy the moments where people are like, oh, when they've realized I'm foreign, they're like, oh, your English is very good. I'm like, yeah, it's my mother tongue. I've been speaking it all my life. Not like since birth. I'm not like a prodigy of some description, right? But like, it was the first language I ever spoke. And so people being weird about it, that's a form of microaggression. It's a form of othering. It's obviously a lot worse for folks who don't mask or pass as easily. But even the energy of having to mask or to pass, to pretend to be that can be problematic. And I appreciate that you've all like chosen to spend a lunchtime in the middle of December talking about diversity and inclusion. So I'm going to assume that many of you are already pretty convinced about this. But as I'm going to rush through these slides, but know that they're there, and there's a load of hopefully very useful links for sharing with colleagues who might not be convinced, or other folks who need more data to believe that this is something worth focusing on. So there's a whole bunch of evidence that diverse teams that are diverse not just in gender, but in a number of ways, intersectionality, are more likely to be high performing, more likely to be innovative. They are more to solve really difficult problems. There's a whole bunch of evidence that shows that having more diversity of industry background, country of origin, career path, gender, all of that matters a lot. Academic background, not so much. Age, not so much. Interesting that there's a negative significant relationship if you have a lot of age diversity. I think that tells us something very interesting about our generational problems. But we can do a whole separate lunchtime session on what that tells us and what we do and learn from it, which I won't digress into right now. But there are not only a lot of examples of how one aspect of diversity improves teams, but how inclusive cultures can be really, really, really impactful. So twice as likely to meet or exceed financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times to be innovative and agile, 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. Those are the kinds of things that if some vendor came to you and was like, hey, I've got a thing that could achieve all of this, you'd be like, just shut up and take my money. Almost every business leader would be just shut up and take my money. And so the fact that we have to scrape and kind of beg to get any time or capacity or budget or whatever to work on this, on inclusion, kind of ridiculous and definitely not a sound financial or business decision, which is quite an interesting tack to take as well. As I say, I'm pretty sure that by attending this, you've kind of told me that you're fairly convinced anyway, but here are a bunch of other examples. But it's not just that diverse teams win, it's also that homogenous teams lose. So if you have a team that is really, really similar to each other, if they're in the, companies in the bottom quartile for racial and ethnic diversity at leadership level are 25% more likely to have financial returns below the national industry medians. So if you want to be below average, you should lack racial and ethnic diversity at a leadership level. You should be aware that many people of color, many women believe that their ethnicity or their gender has negatively affected their career, and people who are neurodivergent especially feel that they're very, very likely to have negative impact to their career if they admit that they're neurodivergent. But inclusion is difficult. So it's not just add diversity, right? If you add people who are different, but you don't do the work to make them able to be themselves and be successful, then you don't actually achieve those outcomes. And so I think one of the things people misunderstand about diversity and about inclusion is that part of why it results in better business outcomes is because it's harder. If you have a load of different people and perspectives and everybody's having, their life experience, their expertise, their view of the world is coming with them to a big discussion about, what strategy should be or what decision we should make, it makes it harder to get to an outcome that everybody agrees with. But I suppose my personal thesis is that work to get these different people with different perspectives to come together and agree on what the right thing to do is, the fact that's hard is why it results in better outcomes. And so getting good at having those conversations and making sure you get the value out of the difference around everybody, that you view difference as a feature rather than a bug, is really, really important. And as I mentioned earlier, the energy that people sometimes have to spend to mask, to pretend to be something they're not, to fit in more with other people is really significant. So Stonewall years ago now did this research that said people can be up to 40% more productive if they can be themselves at work. People genuinely do perform better when they can be themselves. And part of that's just not spending energy on something that other people don't have to spend energy on. People who are not worried about being discriminated against or judged or fired, don't have to think all the time, don't mention the pronoun, don't really talk about what you did at the weekend, they're not having to hide this part of themselves. And I find it really interesting when I talk to my Black friends and Southeast Asian friends and so on. They talk about how much energy it takes to kind of be white passing or to talk and operate and interact in the way that that's expected in very white dominated environments. It's loads of extra energy that would be better spent on the job than on just pretending to be something that they're not. So what do we do about it? This sounds super simple, right? Like stop allowing underprivileged groups to be pushed away and start building actively inclusive environments. Like very easy to say, very difficult to do. So here's a framework that I've used with quite a lot of organizations now that I hope will be useful to you. And I'll talk about how you use this, but also some specific practical examples of like things that have actually resulted in a major improvement that I've seen. And I think whether consciously or unconsciously, people are asking these three questions when they're deciding whether to join your organization, when they're deciding whether to stay, when they're deciding whether to answer that recruiter's phone call or not. When they're deciding whether to say yes to a promotion, people do say no to promotions. I've seen an organization where women disproportionately said no to a particular promotion, and it became a real issue. And when we eventually figured out what was going on, it was that the perception was that the next level up that they were being promoted to meant you had to essentially have a stay-at-home spouse in order to succeed. And very few of these women had the support at home that meant that they could operate in that way. And so we had to go, well, shit, how do we approach this? Do we want only women who have a stay-at-home spouse to be able to be in this kind of role, or do we want to make the role not require you to never see your family, which was not great for any of the other people in that role either, right? But people are asking these questions when they're deciding whether to join, whether to stay, whether to leave. They're going, like, am I expected here? Is someone like me even expected to be at this place? Am I respected? Is my difference seen as a feature or a bug? And can I be myself and be successful here? Am I having to hide? Am I having to mask? Am I having to pretend to be something I'm not? And so when you assess this for your own organization, go look at your website, your Glassdoor, all the different, your LinkedIn profile, whatever else, all the different places that somebody's going to find out information about your company. And this is the true top of your recruitment funnel, right? You never see the true top of your recruitment funnel, which is everybody who knows about you, sees your jobs and decides not to apply. That's the part of your job funnel that you have the least visibility onto. And so when people come to me and they're like, well, we just don't get any applications from anybody for engineering who isn't like a straight white 25-year-old dude, I'm like, yeah, that's because something's telling them they're not expected here. And then very often those conversations go into, okay, let's have a look at your benefits page on your company website. All it has is a foosball machine and beer Wednesdays. Is it really a shock that nobody over 25 is applying to this company? So have a look at what kinds of people feel that they would be expected. What kind of image have you got out in the world? What do people think of when they see you? Think about all these different characteristics that exist, and these do vary by location, right? So the UK protects quite a big list of things. The US does protect most of those things, but also has protection for things like veteran status, bankruptcy background, genetic information, citizen status, but they don't protect sexual orientation or trans status. So some of this you do need to just get it loaded into your head what the various characteristics that matter for your particular location are. But in the most inclusive organizations, we're going beyond this now. We're talking about these other elements that are not legally required, but are very much part of people's experience and whether they feel included or not. So neurodiversity, education level, what their mother tongue was, what their social class or class background is. Even things like, they need to be sober, whether that's for religious reasons or health reasons or other reasons. Introvert, extrovert's one that's got a lot of coverage in recent years. And so think about that kind of external piece, who expects to be there and not. And remember that very top of your recruitment funnel is really not visible to you because you don't see the people who kind of take a look and then abandon the thought. I speak at loads of conferences. I've interviewed at lots of different companies. Almost always, I can't tell ahead of time whether I'm going to be able to access that venue. The disability I've got means I'm sometimes on crutches, sometimes I can walk, sometimes I'm in a wheelchair. And that unpredictability is a pain in the ass, but it means that like I often look this stuff up because I don't know whether on Tuesday my knee will be dislocated. I've literally never interviewed anywhere that information was available on the website of whether I would be able to get to where I was going to without having to deal with stairs. I have interviewed a place where I had to teach multiple of my interviewers how you use the lifts in the building, because yes, it was just one big flight of stairs, but when your knee's dislocated, it's not a good idea to do stairs. If you want people of different religions to work with you, do you have any indication of whether they'll be able to observe their prayer schedule, for instance, if that's something that they need? The number of companies I've been to where there's like a prayer room / breastfeeding room, like what do you do if somebody has to breastfeed at the same time as somebody else is trying to pray? I don't think those are very like easy to combine activities, and the room is like the size of a cupboard anyway. It's not super helpful. So think about, and I've literally done this with some teams, is like give everybody a hat to wear where they're representing one of these groups and go like, how does this look from that perspective? And from a more practical point of view, I used to be very skeptical at role modeling. Then when I started making sure that we always had like some gender diversity, ideally women and men and non-binary and somebody who was happy to talk about their experience as a trans person, then but like definitely just by making sure there was a woman presenting every time, doubled the number of applications that we saw. People will assume that you're a monoculture if they don't see evidence that you're not, because that's the safe assumption for them to make. And don't think just about the role modeling of like, do you have a successful person who looks different? Also think about what the role modeling aspect of things like, what time are your events? I like that this is at lunchtime, that it doesn't mean, when these are 6 p.m, there's a whole bunch of people who've got caring responsibilities that just can't make them. So think not just around gender, and with all of these things, don't just think about one dimension, think about as many as you can. The other super practical thing I found out was that I used to run the internship program at Procter Gamble, and middle of the summer, there was a kind of mid-internship review. One of the sessions there was a role modeling one, and we get someone, director or above, which in a big company like P&G is like super senior. And some brave intern would always ask, like, did you always know you wanted to be so senior? Like when you were us, did you know you were going to get to be there? And I noticed this pattern over the years that the men always said, like, yeah, I always knew I could do more. I backed myself every step of the way. And every woman we didn't have any non-binary folks at the time, unfortunately, but every woman said, no, I didn't ever expect to be here. I certainly didn't think it was guaranteed. And sometimes I had to trust my mentor's belief in me when I didn't have the confidence myself. And that changed me as a manager, in that I went back to my team and was like, fuck, I need to be really sure that I tell people that I believe in them and why I believe in them. And even had a really weird interaction where I told somebody much more specifically what they were great at, and they cried because they had such a severe case of imposter syndrome. They thought they were going to be found out any moment. And I was like, there's literally been a conversation at our exec team that if we haven't had an all hands this year where you haven't got some award or recognition because you're just knocking it out of the park all the time. Like, they'd done like a side project that had saved $4 million or something for another organization in the conglomerate. So they were a real superstar. But yeah, this moment where they cried when I was specific about believing in them really made me realize how more deliberate I needed to be about that as a manager and as a leader, of telling people that I believed in them and why. So something you can do here is like go audit your job specs. Make sure you're not accidentally filtering for arrogance, which is something that a lot of people do. Remember that the job spec is not the interview, it's the thing that gets people to the interview. So resist putting everything you ever want to know in there. Just put the minimum things that get someone to to apply and for you to be able to evaluate whether they are right to take through to interview. And there's a bunch of links here, as you can see, that you can follow up with. The second part of this, as I mentioned earlier, is, am I respected here? So when I interact with this company, this organization, do I feel respected and valued? Do I think I'll be stereotyped? Do people like me work here, right? And so when people are forming this opinion, it's, unlike the am I expected, which is mostly about how you look externally, this is about when they're interacting with your company, either as a candidate or as a customer. In this realm, we really need to educate ourselves and others about privilege and implicit bias. You keep doing what you always did, you'll keep getting what you always got. And so we talked a bit about privilege earlier, so I won't dwell on this too long, but John Scalzi, who's a sci-fi author, has said that, the way he thinks of it and explains it to others is that, straight white male is the lowest difficulty setting on the game of life. It's not that it's an easy game if you have that setting on, it's just that it's easier than everybody else's settings. There's some great research that Harvard did into like passive bias, passive discrimination. If you haven't done this test, it's worth doing. Do it when you're not going to be disturbed, and you can focus on it, because it's all about how fast your reactions are and what that reveals about you. But you can't combat your bias unless you at first know that it's there. And so it's worth doing these kind of things just for you personally to know, shit, I'm likely to be a bit biased against people who don't have the same formal education I have, or I'm going to maybe be a little biased against people who are a different class than me. Let me be aware of that, so then I can be actively bearing it in mind, or at least kind of accommodating it, so I can try to target that myself to notice, to then go, shit, okay, I shouldn't trust myself on this. That might be me being biased. And I suppose the other part of this is to remember that, like, a lot of people who are marginalized or feel like they're underrepresented or under-indexed, they end up feeling like they're also the representative of everybody like them. And that pressure is very real and very problematic. Work on de-biasing your interview process, focus on past performance, real experiences. People are very bad at spotting potential unless it's in people who very closely map to the kind of leaders and managers that they've seen in the past. So just be aware of that. Like you may not accurately assess potential in people who don't mirror leaders that you've seen in the past. And something that was surprisingly effective that some of the team at Monzo started doing just off their own back, having understood how problematic bias was, many of them started writing up their interviews in gender-neutral language, so using they, them rather than he or she. And it helped them notice themselves when they were like maybe saying something that they wouldn't normally have said. For instance, or there's some decent evidence that men are not judged on likability anywhere near as much as other genders are. Think about how you do interview comms. There's a bunch of really specific examples and questions there that I'd suggest you work through. And in general, just kind of try to think about all the touch points somebody's going to have with you as a company before they're an employee and after they're an employee or a customer, and go, is everybody from all different demographics going to have an equally positive experience? And then lastly, like, can I be myself and be successful here? If you only remember one of these questions, this is the one to remember. So people are thinking, how much am I going to have to pretend to be something I'm not in order to do well here? And long run, that's exhausting, and it can lead to burnout and all sorts of other problems. And so think about whether the norms and the ways of behaving and the ways of communicating in your team are set by a group that's a bit homogenous, and everybody else is having to fall into line with it. I think about one of the great questions in First Break All the Rules is, do I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day? And so trying to make everybody the same, we used to do this 30 years ago, we used to figure out what people are bad at and then focus on that. But taking somebody from bad at something to mediocre at something takes a lot of energy. And maybe that energy better spent getting them from like good to great on something that they're already proficient at. And so rather than trying to make everybody exactly the same, and really that requires you to just focus on mediocrity, because if you're trying to get them all to be exactly the same, you're focusing on what they're not good at and leveling them up. Maybe it's more like a by our powers combined, right? Focus on getting the most out of difference. We're not interchangeable resource units. And I tell developers all the time, if their manager is calling them a resource, they should start referring to the manager as overhead until they stop it. We're, you know, whether it's colors, like pick your preferred metaphor here, like we're colors, we're flavors, we're better in complement or in concert with each other. I would watch the hell out of a 7 Healx movie, but the Avengers are cool because they're good at different stuff, right? They have different abilities and powers and whatever else. So let's think of this more like casting. And we put someone in the role where they are able to use their superpowers, their difference, the things they're great at, they're getting to use every day, and they're paired up or partnered in a team with people who have some strengths where they have weaknesses. So how do we assess that? Assemble a great team with complementary abilities. As a side note, love this movie, totally recommend it. Even better if you watch it believing that it's Thor's attempt to have a Clark Kent character, it being like Thor's alter ego makes it an even better movie. And then check if systems are loaded. So pay rises being based on like a pitch for pay rise, having to brag in order to get a financial improvement. It's not a good idea. Tends to not just favor men, tends to favor people who are from Western individualistic societies. And again, it can filter for arrogance in a way that's not super helpful. Train yourself and your managers to spot bias feedback and to address it. And bear in mind all the times that you're really giving people advice that just sounds like, be more like a straight cis American white guy, ideally quite a loud one. To help people find ways to be successful and to be themselves. And this is another area where role modeling matters. Like, you don't have to, I don't find someone who's a direct role model for me very often. Like, there's not many people who are the particular combination of things that I am, right? But I've worked places where all of the leadership looked like they were not only wearing matching ties and outfits, but that they were probably wearing matching underwear to go with their matching haircuts. As you can imagine, it was not a very diverse in any regard leadership team, and that showed in the long run in that organization. And so, people's reactions to that kind of being forced to mask, to be something that they're not, is sometimes is to flee, sometimes is to fight. This swan is probably my patron saint, and I would totally believe that I could stop that truck, even with plenty of evidence to the contrary. So think about that reality, that people are going to have these kind of reactions to poor advice, but also that some of that advice just is not sensible for them to take. So you, as a leader, as a manager, encourage valuing the what over the how. So know when people need telling what to do, get them what they need the rest of the time. But mostly the biggest takeaway here is if you're trying to manage anybody who's quite different from you, you're going to get more out of developing coaching skills than anything else. Because sometimes the thing that might work for you, if they're different enough from you, won't work for them. Even simple things like, there's a whole bunch of really distressing evidence that if women take men's advice and try to negotiate job offers, women are way more likely to have the job offer rescinded rather than the negotiation actually happen, which is awful, but also real. And so when you have men acting as mentors for women, they often give them advice that isn't very safe for them to take. The same thing happens when you have white folks like myself trying to mentor people of color without sufficiently understanding how different it is and how those reactions might be different. The other thing about it is just like how you frame stuff. We had a huge improvement in performance in our intern cohort by reframing networking as less you never know who might be useful to you, so talk to everyone you can, and more, in this 10, 12 weeks, you're going to become an expert in something, and you might be able to help other people. And the moment it became more about, bigger pie rather than stealing more of the pie, people coped a lot better. Mentoring sometimes isn't helping people at all. So think about whether sometimes you need to focus more on sponsorship. Mentoring is what somebody says when you're in the room with them. Sponsorship is when you're not even in the room and they're trying to help make opportunities happen for you, or put you forward for things, or make sure that you're considered for promotion. And so some senior leaders need a lot of training in how to do sponsorship effectively rather than just mentoring. And so when people are thinking, can I make myself be successful here? They're thinking about all these things. Are there role models? Do I have to change who I am to succeed? Are there multiple visible routes to success? How much energy am I going to have to spend pretending? And do the processes here seem to be actively trying to combat the bias that we know exists and is a real thing for people? I think every role is, and every person is capable of being great. Like, very few people wake up in the morning being like, today I'm aiming for just south of mediocre. And if I can mess everybody else up along the way, then my day will be perfect. Like, there's the occasional person who's an asshole like that. But most people wake up in the morning wanting to be good at what they do. And I think if we take that assumption and try to create organizations and cultures where difference is a feature, not a bug, then we can create organizations that are much better for all kinds of people, not just under-indexed folk, but for everybody. These are all just summary slides. The last thing I'd say is, for those of you who maybe aren't in an under-indexed group yourself, but you're trying to work out how to be a good ally, Dorothy Herpa said to me once, she doesn't want allies anymore. She wants accomplices. She wants people who are going to come do crime with her to make it better. And I think that's a great way of thinking about it. What can you do to be much more active in how you help, and to be more of an accomplice rather than just an ally? I think we go straight to questions. How do you recommend bringing senior leadership to understand the difference between equity and equality? I feel it rarely isn't understood with respect to people with disabilities who need different support depending on the person. One size doesn't fit all. So I've literally used that graphic that I showed you earlier about how treating everybody the same doesn't result in equal outcomes. So I've used a combination of the privilege walk, which I haven't been keeping track of all the chat, but I think somebody maybe posted one of those videos, and that diagram with the 3 boxes, just one under each person, versus stacked appropriately to offset the difference in opportunity. The other thing that's useful, if you have a leadership team that's very resistant even when you've explained the concepts really clearly, is put them through some of the Harvard unconscious bias or similar things. They're often wrongly under the impression that they are not biased and that this is not a problem at their company. And if they are still in the boat of thinking people who are good rise to the top and people who are not fall, and just thinking it's as simple as that person's capability, they're not thinking about this in the way that's matching reality yet. So for those folks who just really don't understand that the world is different depending on how you show up in it and what background you have, I tend to send those folks on unconscious bias training to kind of really understand what their own base position is, because the folks who don't want to engage in this work are usually the most biased when they do those kind of tests, and getting them to engage with that and let's just do something about it is important. Do you want to mark that one as done and we can move on to there we go. Today's global trends such as nationalism, polarized world, COVID, mental health tend to move away focus from diversity and inclusion topics. Most firms actually mean to talk of gender diversity and not so much about minorities, cultural age and thinking approaches. What are 2 to 3 radical things that can be done to bring about a change from a systems thinking perspective? So I actually think that many of those external factors, well, certainly COVID, mental health, etc., those are all part of diversity and inclusion topics. I think COVID and the pandemic generally have illustrated how big those differences in how people are treated by the world, how they show up. It's intensified the impact on them. I agree completely that we should be talking about diversity in a much broader sense than gender, and certainly than binary gender. And so in terms of like, what are the two or three things that can be done to bring out radical things? Train everybody on unconscious bias. Take that framework and really look at, take a group of people who you think really understand your company and your processes and everything, and give them each an identity to represent. Give them a little bit of notice ahead of time so they can go read, they can go like stalk on Twitter, see what the conversations are in that particular community, and then use that framework to look at every part. And then the third, I don't know, it's radical, but it's effective thing is to really help leaders and managers understand what sponsorship is, because that training usually results in them realizing they have been sponsoring, but they've only been doing it for a certain type of person who very closely matches the current leaders. And that they're going to have to actively choose to do something different if they're going to have a more reasonable range of people that they're sponsoring up the ranks. That helps. Next one's, I'd love to hear your perspective on how to gather and give meaningful feedback with a minority individual / line manager relationship, and to know how supported minority people feel within a team or organization. So I think, and I'm going to make an important distinction. I think sometimes people are in the minority generally. Sometimes they're just underrepresented or under-indexed. Like women are like 51% of the population are presumed female at birth anyway. But women are often still underrepresented or under-indexed in certain layers in a company's leadership roles, etc., etc. So one side is just remember it. Somebody may not always be in a minority in order to experience marginalization. In terms of gathering and giving meaningful feedback, I think the onus is on the manager to form an understanding by doing research themselves, rather than expecting the employee to educate them about what the concerns for that person might be. So you've got someone with ADHD, go read up about it. I think by showing understanding and asking smarter questions rather than super basic questions, the individual often already feels like things are better. But remember that you might show bias in some of those things and how you interpret them. So try to make it a relationship where if you get it wrong, they'll be comfortable telling you that. And then in terms of knowing how supported people feel, some of that's about you playing the role I mentioned, which is as a manager, you need to spot when somebody is giving biased feedback, and you decide before you pass it on to the individual whether you're going to do something about it. So when, I have definitely received feedback that's along the lines of like, well, this person should just smile more. And I'm like, I don't get that when it's men. Would you give this feedback to this other person? They don't smile very much. And going back and like helping the individual realize how biased they're being is often the useful thing. Sometimes it's important for the individual to know that bias exists as well. And so sometimes I will give visibility for the individual, but you've got to choose carefully when and how to do that. In the broader sense, though, one of the most useful things here is things like Beequal or other engagement surveys, and making sure there's a well-crafted question in there, but also that you have the ability to slice and dice the information you get from your engagement tool by demographic. So you want to be able to see are, people who are the same nationality as the company runs in, are they more likely to be more or less likely to be loyal? You want to be able to separate that out and see it. And that requires having a element of demographic information gathered that you can then cross-reference again. I've certainly been in a couple of places where we worked with Beequal on how to introduce that kind of demographic information so we could do better analysis. And I'm sure it's possible with other tools as well. That's just the one that I know for sure I have done it with in a couple of places. I'm going to try zip through the next. We've got like 8 minutes left, so I will do my best to get to these. If I don't get to them, I'll do follow-ups afterwards, written. So Patricia's 2 questions are: AI is playing a key role in recruitment, e.g. LinkedIn. What's your view on the role of AI filtering in and out diversity now and in the future? AI is like many things, garbage in, garbage out. The most problematic use of AI and data science is when it's essentially like money laundering for bias. So famously in the US, they took they took the last 50 years worth of mortgage decisions from a bank and reproduced racism in the algorithm, because there were a load of racist decisions made in that bank of 50 decisions. And so obviously the algorithm that was trained on those decisions was also racist. And so I think being really, really, there's an entire field of AI ethics. There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff around how you handle data and so on. So being skeptical and asking the questions about what data was used in the first place, and remembering what the sociocultural context of that data was, is really important. In terms of the how do we move from managing D&I as separate pillars to intersectional D&I reflecting real employees' experiences, I think the first step is to do all process and company side work holistically, and then to acknowledge that maybe your employee representation groups or your ERGs or whatever else, maybe they want to organize by these different strands, and there are different issues if you are if what your experience is bias based on race than if it's bias based on disability, for instance, right? But it's all about experiencing bias or lack of inclusion versus not. So the other thing is to make sure that the leaders of those different groups are a team together as well. So a lot of the progress we made when I led the LGBTQ network group at P&G way back in the day, and we would make sure we were closely connected with the minorities group, with the religious folks, and the fact that sometimes it was the LGBTQ group going, hey, I think it's a problem that this new office doesn't have a prayer room planned. That's not very inclusive. Like we took on each other's concerns and messages and made sure that if only one of those groups was in the room for whatever reason, we would try to remind everybody that there were concerns from the other perspectives. And in general, you try to get it to be more systems thinking, and in particular, reject this kind of thing of, oh, we'll focus on binary gender, we'll do men and women first, and then when we fix that problem, we'll get to the rest. Because that's a tactic we've been trying to use for 50 years, and it's not fucking working. So anybody who says, oh, we've got to focus on this one first and then we'll have time for the others, like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. We've been doing that for decades and we have still got almost nowhere. So it's clearly not working. And so a more holistic approach is definitely needed. How you execute that in all of it, I suppose the main advice I've got is like, think about this. Am I expected? Am I respected? Can I be myself and be successful? And figure out what the blockers are to those being easy to answer yes to for all different types of people. If you're really lucky, you've got all different types of people, you bring them into a room and you talk with them about it. If not, then you ask people to adopt a different perspective and represent it for the, I suppose, that evaluation being done. Alice has asked, what would you recommend for a startup that sort of identifies their issues and is somewhat willing to put money towards this, but doesn't necessarily know where to start because there's so much to do? Is there any training? If you're going to do anything, start with the last one. So for your current people, making it true that they can say, I can be myself and be successful here is the most important thing. Because otherwise you add people who are different, they have a shit experience and they leave. And then you have not just a inclusion problem, but also a hiring problem, because you now have a reputation as somewhere that people who are different from whatever the perceived or actual majority is, that they don't stay and they don't last. And in terms of training, there's loads of people doing great training around this. So the Other Box is someone I've used before to do unconscious bias training for organizations. But I suppose what I normally would do is start with that kind of inventory, those 3 questions, figure out where your problems are. If you're actually a super inclusive culture, and genuinely not just like a bunch of people who are very similar to each other telling themselves that, but actually you are, then sometimes you then just focus on, okay, how do we make sure that our external face reflects our internal reality? But almost always there is an actual issue with the internal reality. So that's the like answer I can give in a minute. If you want a load more detail, then drop me a message on Twitter, and I'll try to follow up with you as well. Someone's asked, you have moved around a fair bit in your career. How have you determined the right time to move on? What were the main reasons you moved jobs? I have ended up in a position where what I'm mostly hired for these days is scaling, and so. Particularly so I was 10 years in my first company. I was at Procter Gamble for the first 10 years of my career, and then I have moved a bunch in the interim. But even when I was at P&G, I did like 7 roles in 10 years, did the equivalent of a 20-year career in a decade. And some of that's just that I am bored very rapidly and get to the point of being confident making decisions faster than most. And so, but the main reason that my more recent gigs have been, a couple of years and then move is I tend to be brought in for the big scaling phase. Like when you're going to have to triple the team in a year, or 500% growth in a really short period of time. I once did a 30 to 300 in 9 months, which was very hectic, and I would not recommend it, but it is possible. And so I tend to be, I suppose, grabbed for the next scaling opportunity is the main reason that I have ended up moving. And I always try to find something that's a purpose I care about. James has asked, as a white British straight middle class man in tech leadership, for the record, like some of my best friends are white British straight middle class men in tech leadership, for the record, like it's not a bad thing to be, but you said, how can I help, show my support, be a better accomplice? So one thing is like attending shit like this and even just understanding the problem. Well done. Thank you for being here. The next thing I'd recommend is watch a talk by Anwan Simmons that he did for Lead Dev a few years ago called Lending Privilege, which is all about how you can understand the privilege that you have and then do something useful with it. And so there's some like really simple examples, like something that men in tech can do is share their salary with their female counterparts and non-binary counterparts and anybody else who is different to them, not just in gender terms, but in race and orientation, everything else. Like, it's shocking how frequently there is still a pay gap. And we talk about the gender pay gap a lot, and that's a sort of averaged out thing, but it's still a legal requirement that equal pay for equal work. And so just, if you think somebody is your peer, do you think that they're doing just as good work and just as much work as you, and it's the same work, don't be afraid to go share with them what you earn. And like, if you really want to lend your privilege, like if they're earning a lot less than you, help them when they go have that conversation about why the hell that's happening. But even just if you're not ready for the full accomplice bit, the good ally thing is just be open to sharing your comp, because having real data really, really helps people to know whether there's an actual issue or they just see that, there's a statistically a likely chance that there is. And then Reshma asked, how do you deal with generational and age diversity? I think the same way that you do with all the other types, which is just to try and help people understand each other better, understand what's easier and more difficult for whatever reason or factor, and then try. I suppose the goal of inclusion is to try design processes, ways of working, ways of interacting, ways of communicating that either are putting everybody on equal footing. So, everybody is, the people who are at a disadvantage, you've added an advantage for them, so everybody's on a level playing field. Or sometimes what people end up doing is, if there is sometimes not one single way of doing things that will then remove that disadvantage for everyone. So you do things in multiple ways. So, like, an example I do see with generational diversity is a difference in comfort with different comms mechanisms. And so sometimes for that, you want to not just have the live all hands every week, but also record it. So somebody who, and some of this is a generational age thing, some of it's also a neurodiversity thing. Like, some people will want to watch the video back. Some people want to read like the 3 bullet point summary of what happened. And some people want there to be like a full, like a detailed write-up, right? And you may not want to do all of those things, but what's the mix that you've got and the comfort level that you've got? And if what you don't want to happen is that however you choose to do your kind of company information sharing wildly disadvantages an entire generation of people, which is possible to do accidentally, but it is possible to do. Same as if you did everything written and then you have somebody who's really severely dyslexic, it can be very difficult for them to break in and interact with everybody else, because the only mechanism for interaction has at some point been decided to be written. Does that make sense? I appreciate we're 3 minutes over time. I know that some folks probably have stuck around, but anybody who didn't, it's no issue at all. I will catch up on the chat in a minute, but thank you all very much for joining.